Good afternoon. Welcome to our virtual town hall for the TTC project, March 12th, 2020. We're going to focus on issues relative to instructional academic staff and some of the project background that kind of leads us to where we are now in the project. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. I'm Dan Chanin, the Director of Compensation and Benefits for the University of Wisconsin System and project lead for the TTC project on the system side of the house. So much of what we'll be talking about today is really with that focus on the system institutions versus UW-Madison. You can submit questions during today's presentation using the box at the bottom of the screen, so please do feel free to do that. But if you are watching this in a rerun, you can always submit questions through the project email at ttc@uwsa.edu. So if you are watching this not live, we are always open to those questions. If you're looking for that project website, if you just go to the wisconsin.edu homepage and search TTC, you'll find the project site. So we just wanted to kind of level set and begin this conversation by level setting what the project is, where we're at, and then a little bit of background information I think will be relevant to our discussion today. Again, the goal of the TTC project was to create clear, consistent, and relevant job titles and descriptions, and to have market-informed pay and benefit structure. And so a lot of this has been review of how do we make sure that we're paying at market, and also looking at our kind of benefits package and kind of aligning to say how competitive are we within our relevant market. And finally, looking at that framework for career development. How do we refresh and update that? And today we'll be talking a little bit in detail about instructional academic staff issues and some of the questions that we've been receiving at a project level. Some things to keep in mind as we go forward, that while we are creating career frameworks, ultimately the TTC project itself will make recommendations about salary structure, but there'll be no impact on individual pay from the project, right? It's just a recommended structure. So let's talk a little bit about guiding principles. Really looking at four major areas where we try to operate as a project. One is collaborative. We meet regularly with the advisory council, which is system-wide joint governance. So we're meeting with them actually tomorrow on a almost weekly basis with institutional HR leadership regarding the progress of the project. So really kind of working collaboratively to make sure that we know where the project is going at all times, and then hopefully that information filtering down. We also try to be communicative about where we're at. So regular periodic chancellor update emails that go out to campuses, these series of virtual town hall meetings like today and our past ones that are on the system website, and campus level institutions and forums and newsletters that are being communicated through the HR directors on staff. We really focus on trying to be inclusive about how we operate as a project to the extent possible, really looking at engaging subject matter experts from across the system in that design and development of the standard job description library, and in the refinement of that library has been ongoing. So at the initial outset of drafting, looking at representative committees from across the system to draft those initial standard job description, and then really trying to be transparent. So why we're here today and why you see so much information on our website is to try to communicate as effectively and as efficiently as possible what's out there. And you'll see that part of that transparency commitment that we've discussed with joint governance was making sure we put out there the draft standard job description library so that we could get review and comment. And we have posted that since about December, and I've gotten a wealth of feedback that we're really looking at as we try to incorporate that final stage of the project of rolling out finalized job descriptions. So again, if you're looking for resources and looking for that transparent where are we at in terms of drafting, the online standard job description library is available. Being able to go and access that and provide us with comments as we kind of work into the final stages of having employee manager conversations in the coming months, that information should be available to you. So a quick review of what is changing and what is staying the same. I think I'm going to focus a little bit on what's staying the same, right? Your job duties as you individually perform them remain unchanged. Really what we're trying to do is create a title structure, a job framework that makes sense in terms of how we align ourselves to the market, how do we market price those jobs, how do we align our titles with what's out there within what we see as the marketplace. So that's what's changing, right? The how do we describe this work from a technical standpoint versus what you actually do on a day-to-day basis does not change. Your actual salary does not change, right? Employee pay does not change. Your reporting relationships do not change, right? The TTC won't change who your supervisor is or who you supervise. Performance and goals, those things that are driven by your conversations with your manager do not change. And your employee category and benefits. So if you're a university staff today, you will remain university staff. If you're academic staff, you'd remain academic staff in terms of your category and benefits. So what will change? As we mentioned, we're looking to change the structure, modernize our structure. You have to recall that for 30 years or so, many of our job titles have not been looked at. They were controlled by a state system. And so as we move away from that and have our own personnel authority, we want to make sure that the structure works for the University of Wisconsin system setting. So that will require also changes in your job titles in terms of title of record, and then a review and update of working titles to make sure that they're within reason in terms of how they're being applied across the system. So business titles, which would be your current working titles. The job descriptions will change. They become shorter, more concise, more of a broad brush of are these consistently and fairly the scope of someone's job. And then the compensation structure will change. In other words, how do we align these jobs to pay categories? That will change. But again, employee individual pay will not change. We'll just be recommending a structure so that going forward we can operate within a new framework. And then we'll also be talking about changing and updating our salary administration guidelines. And I think that'll be relevant to our discussion about academic titles, in particular the lecturer and senior lecturer title, because what we see here in terms of what is changing and what is going away, the job title, lecturer, a broad category, how does that interact with business title, which in this future state would be a senior lecturer designation, for example. And then how does that work within our salary administration guidelines in terms of how do people get pay progression in a future state? And so we want to walk through all that today and anticipate we'll have lots of questions and discussions during that question comment time at the end of this presentation. So who is impacted? Just about everyone, not everyone though. So faculty are out of scope, student workers are out of scope, employees in training are out of scope, but almost all academic university staff and limited term employees. There's a star next to academic staff. We're trying to move towards a standard job description and a standard titling process, but there are a number of academic staff positions that are out of scope. That list is available on our website, on the standard job description library. There's a link to the full list. But for example, clinical professors, adjunct professor titles, are out of scope. So what that means is that really at this time, we're not looking at them. We're trying to get our other titles aligned, including, for example, the lecture title, which we'll talk about in more detail, onto that structure. But they're out of scope for the time being. And so that list is available for review. So where are we at? If you've been following the project for a while now, you've probably seen this graphic. We are getting very close to that implementation phase. We're late in the winter, but we'll be starting now those employee manager conversations in the coming weeks, with the goal to wrap them up by early spring, May, with that implementation here over the summer in terms of switching HRS job titles. So really this spring is that critical period of employee manager conversations and feedback with a formal implementation, which I'm really defining here as when will these appear as job titles of record in the HRS system would be over the summer, this summer. So we are in the final kind of months of this standard job description, job titling part of the project. So as we talk about pay progression, there's probably two big pieces that we need to talk about, which are relevant to senior lecturer and instructional academic staff titling. One is pay progression versus promotion, and one is business titling. So we're going to talk a little bit about those concepts today because they are relevant. So pay progression versus promotion. In our current world, we have title series. Title series would be, for example, an associate lecturer, senior lecturer. Really what that was or is a movement through a series of job titles that reflect a change of skill and competence over time within a set of duties that are relatively similar. I think we've been relatively informal in calling those promotions and having distinct titles for them. And so as you kind of see in that graphic on your screen, that there's what we would have maybe called promotion through grades in the current structure with prefix titles associated with it. In that future state, we're really talking about pay progression, which is within this wider range. When someone gains knowledge, skills, experience, is performing well, but their job core responsibilities remain the same. Even though you may be adding additional duties as you become more senior, that's really what we call pay progression. And so there would be one title for that, and pay would increase for a variety of reasons, kind of listed there on the screen. Pay plan, market changes, retention, parity within a department, but also increasing knowledge, skill, performance is pay progression. In contrast, promotion is a title change where you move to a new set of responsibilities with a new job that are distinct from the current work being performed. And distinct meaning not just a progression in terms of skills and ability or even the addition of one or two duties, but really a distinct set of work. So again, how can pay increase over time? Well, performance, again, parity. We're looking within a classification. How do we make sure people are paid fairly within their classification relative to their peers? Equity, right? Those salary differences across race, gender, age that we want to make sure that as a system we're monitoring and making sure we're treating people fairly, and market adjustments. Right? We need to be sensitive to what do other institutions pay for similarly situated positions, and how are we making sure that we take that into account in the salaries that we're offering. Promotion in general would be that movement to a new job, typically through a recruitment. So, moving from, say, a manager job to a director job. That director job might be posted, and then there would be new job duties and an application pool, promotion to a new job. But it can also happen in the ways in which you've seen happen within our institution now, which is changing responsibilities over time, where they're changing due to an organizational or business need, and a new standard job description becomes appropriate. That type of reclassification, which we might call it in our current world, that also can happen as a way to promote to a new or higher pay grade based on the job itself. So those are still available to us. TTC is not necessarily changing the way in which we promote or recruit, but we are trying to make our language more consistent in terms of how we talk about these events, how we talk about pay increases, so that we have hopefully less confusion over time and more consistent policies. So what is a business title? A business title is really akin to our current working title. It is used to clarify a person's role within an organization, to kind of better describe the work performed within a role and align to kind of industry best practices that are out there. It cannot be used to, say, misrepresent the level of authority within the organization, or duplicate a title that's already in the record. So calling yourself the director of financial aid when there's a director of financial aid title and you've been assigned a manager title wouldn't be appropriate. But it might be appropriate to use a director title because you're looking at an external market for, say, where it's important to be deemed a director in order to participate at, with your peers at a conference. So it's really kind of a general guidelines that we're putting out there. Within the instructional academic staff world and the world of lecturer and senior lecturer, senior is very much a business title that would be an appropriate designation that kind of clarifies someone's role within the organization in terms of recognizing their time within an organization, higher level of contribution within that job duty, higher level of performance over time. And so senior is really being used as a business title, a clarifier to distinguish between a lecturer and a senior lecturer. So that becomes a business title under the new proposed system. So let's talk about what are the instructional academic titles that are in the standard job description library, and what is a business title. So teaching professor is currently a proposed title of record. Note on the teaching professor is that is one that will require campus level work about the decision to use that and then assign it. And we would recommend that there would have to be work with governance groups at local institutions to do that. Same with a research professor, which is a possible choice as well. Teaching faculty, and I will say that we have been working very closely with Madison because Madison really has more people in this group than other institutions, and then lecturer. So looking at that business title example that I mentioned on the last slide, senior lecturer becomes a business title. It clarifies that role within the organization, and kind of externally, it's what appears on a business card or on a website, senior lecturer. So lecturer is a title of record. Senior lecturer is in terms of a business title of what is presented to the world. Looking at my own title, I'm not a director unspecified, is my official title of record. Right, my business title, Director of Benefits and Compensation, what would be presented to the world. And so I think we need to kind of talk about that a little bit in terms of what the difference between an official title of record is and a business title. So there are ultimately, if your job title is within scope, which really it's lecturer and current faculty associates, you're looking at lecturer and teaching faculty as kind of those equivalent in-scope jobs, with research professor and teaching professor being new additions to the library that will get rolled out as institutions work with governance groups about whether and how to use those. So again, talking through that business title versus title of record, I think one of the things that we've heard is that in somehow removing the word senior is a takeaway from that lecturer position. And I think we want to reemphasize that title of record is a broad bucket of work, whereas the business title is also housed within the HRS system and will be collected and inputted as part of the TTC kind of upload process. Both of those are housed within the human resources system. Thinking of that title of record as more of a bucket of work or classification, and your business title as that level of specificity that appears on your business card, appears on your website, and has that more nuanced recognition of position within that community. So they have equal weight. So I think I want to kind of emphasize that. So senior lecturer, will it be used as a business title? Can it, should it, will it? Really, I think the short answer is yes. I think if you're a senior lecturer now, it would be appropriate for that to be your business title. And then it would be appropriate for campuses to use this opportunity to review and clarify what are those standards in which we allow someone to call themselves senior lecturer. And so this is kind of an opportunity for institutions and governance groups to review what are our standards for looking at and calling someone senior. And the other kind of point of clarification is how do we look at that teaching professor title, that distinct set of work, and clarify when as an institution or if as an institution we're going to be using the teacher professor role. That will then become a new additional title once your campus has kind of reviewed the use of that with governance groups. So we're opening up a potential future title set, the teaching professor, and we're really still allowing and recognizing the business title senior lecturer. So a few things about teaching professor to keep in mind, right? The criteria will have to meet the standard job description criteria and really does need review by governance groups. And that really is both instructional academic staff and faculty have really weighed in on that. And I think the history of why this job has started where it has is really an identified need in terms of recruitment and recognition of a group of non-tenured instructional academic staff that when we recruit for these positions, we really need a title that matches what is out there in the market. So we've identified that kind of need from both a recruitment and retention standpoint. But we also recognize we want to make sure that there's a clear distinction between faculty and tenured professor status and a teaching professor, which is an instructional academic staff non-tenured position, and making sure that the institutional level policies are in place to make that criteria clear. So a word about some additional follow-up. Many of those instructional academic staff titles, lecturer, teaching faculty, teaching professor, currently do not have a salary max. They only have a salary minima. Really, in both the current state and the future state, that really remains the same. So we're maintaining that current practice for instructional academic staff of really having the minima tied to a percentage of faculty salary minima. So I think really here we're talking about a titling issue, right? How do we reflect titles in HRS between title of record and that business title? But we're not really changing the general structure in terms of how do we pay instructional academic staff. Pay progression, however, becomes more flexible because for all employees as we roll out new salary administration guidelines, we really want to open up that question of how are we looking at pay raises, and how do we encourage that periodic development to move people through pay progression over the course of their career. And that's really why the policies are written in such a way as to provide flexibility to institutions to reward employees over time. And that's really something that we're working to make sure stays in place. So we're maintaining senior lecturer as a title in the business title world. And we're also making sure that institutions have the flexibility to compensate employees based on their internal policies. We think that ultimately this will lead to improved alignment with market data over time as we kind of roll out the full instructional academic staff title set of having figured out our institutional level policies on teaching professor. When you look at that market data, and really when you ask what do you mean by matching to market, what you really see out there is that there's for non-tenured instructional academic staff, you see a lecturer title, and then you see levels of teaching professor as kind of how do other institutions compensate. Now that's about market data, and I kind of want to caution there that if you go out and Google the web for other academic institutions, you will most certainly see things like senior lecturer and other variations of titles. But those again are the business titles. They're the front-facing titles. But when we're looking at how do people compensate within the market, those market surveys that we kind of use for looking at what's an appropriate title of record, what you're really seeing out there in the data is a lecturer and levels of teaching professor. So we're trying to better align our title sets in terms of title of record with what's out there. But when we say what's out there, we're really referring to surveys versus what's out there in terms of how people refer to themselves, which would more closely align to the business titles. So as we move through this, really TTC is creating a aligned framework, but there are still some institutional levels decisions that need to be made. So while business title of senior lecturer available, it's out there, that question of how do we review those standards? What are our current standards for calling someone a senior lecturer? How do those get applied? Ultimately will be an institution level decision. The criteria for the use or non-use of teaching professor really need to be that next step of how do we put that out there and how does that impact future state over time. And then really that consultation process with governance. So we meet with joint governance at a project level, but there is kind of work to be done. And I know institutions are at different places in this process. Some of them are actively discussing the use of teaching professor, and other institutions may not have begun that, but there is a broader range of work to do as we implement TTC. But we will be kind of bringing along institutions in a way that makes new opportunities available, as appropriate. So now we're opening up for questions and concerns, and probably the most interesting part of our program today. And so I'm pausing here and taking a look at the screen and seeing what kind of questions come up. So question one. What if after 22 years as a senior lecturer, you're already beyond the top of the pay range for the new title lecturer, and how can your compensation then increase without a promotion? It's an excellent question. So with our current ranges and with our future ranges, really instructional academic staff titles are aligned with a minima, not a maximum. So there's not going to be a new title of lecturer that puts a new top on the pay range for a lecturer. So if you're a senior lecturer, you're compensated at a certain level, you're not going to move into a lecturer title and have a new top. There'll be no new maximum. So not an issue. How can your compensation increase without a promotion? I think this is something that's really central. When we were first working on this and we had a committee of instructional academic staff, one of the things that we were asked as a project is, will you create new promotional opportunities, right? Which really is, will you create new ways to advance our title, which again would be new titles. I think that's the opposite direction of where we're going in terms of all of our titles, which is we're not seeing those title sets. So the question is, how do you get an increase if you're a senior lecturer now, you've been here 22 years? The answer is that ability to provide someone a pay increase is no longer tied to whether or not there's a title to bump into. Now, instructional academic staff function a little bit differently than other positions in that other academic staff positions, we'll say, a director of benefits position, there's a very firm pay range and there's a top to that. So at some point you do top out of pay ranges, but instructional academic staff titles are a little bit more flexible. And part of that flexibility is because pay for university staff instruction often varies a lot by the discipline that you teach. And so there can't be a single solitary range for faculty, for professor, or for lecturers as well. So there is a little more variability. But that's an excellent question. Question 2. Can a senior lecturer who's been advising students for 22 years be assigned teaching professor, as it's the only title that explicitly talks about advising students? So when we go back to that question of the teaching professor, really that's being rolled out as an available title. So really we want to see institutions grapple with how does that operationalize at our campus. So as a project, people are not being assigned to the teaching professor role at this time. Once campuses have had that discussion, make a decision about using it, they then in a future state can place people into that, but the initial mapping of a lecturer would be to a lecturer, right? That's the general broad brush title. Retaining that senior lecturer designation as a business title, so recognizing senior lecturer. When a campus then has clarified their criteria for a teaching professor and looking at that more robust job description, they can then be remapped or placed into that at a later date. And so you really kind of will see a two-step process here as we roll out that teaching professor. Remember that is something new to our institutions and new to us. And so, I think the question is, will you get there? Potentially. Remember that in the application of our job duties, the job duties are the minimum that need to be done to be in a title. People do perform more job duties or responsibilities than may be listed in what is a concise standard job description. So what you're experiencing on the instructional academic staff side, very parallel to what you're seeing in other, the way in which we're applying other job titles. Question 3. Some institutions are not using all the titles like teaching faculty. They're only using teaching professor and lecturer, and that feels limiting. So I think we have to look at where we are right now. The answer is not all institutions use all of our titles, right? So with teaching faculty, that job set, that is really something that is based on trying to create clarity around what is currently our faculty associate job titles. Faculty associate job titles are primarily used at Madison, with very limited use at other institutions. Most institutions do not use that title. So really the fact that some institutions are not mapping to all of those instructional academic staff titles is really akin to our current state. But I think what's happening is now we're having a more robust discussion at those campuses of what is appropriate, and this is the beginning, right? This is the beginning of that discussion. So one of the questions is that okay that institutions are implementing this a bit differently? So I think there are some core principles in terms of how the lecturer job description applies. Really, we're creating those minimum standards to be in a job classification. But yeah, there will be nuances between institutions. And part of this is a iterative process where we really try to say, let's set those standards, let's have those discussions, let's come back together, and let's have more discussions if there needs to be course correction. I think one of the things when we're looking at a system this size with institutions that do have distinct kind of authority under their chancellors, we want to make a system that is flexible enough to meet the unique needs of each institution, and then have enough standardization to meet the needs of the system. And that's a conversation. And as you roll out something new, there needs to be kind of a back and forth to make sure we get that right. I think what's really important to understand that as we roll out the TTC project and we roll out new title mapping, it's not that we're going to roll this out and July 1 never talk about it again. I think we need to roll this out. We need to discuss impacts, and we need to continue to assess whether or not there needs to be better alignment or whether or not there needs to be more freedom. And I think that's one of the things that we need to work on an ongoing basis. And it's not as simple as kind of a one and done type of a scenario. So question 4, help me understand why the lecturer series is the only teaching academic staff title in scope and not other titles like clinical professor. When will the other titles be looked at like adjuncts? So yeah, I mean, this is a major phase 1 of the project to kind of look at the titles we have in front of us. But there's a lot of work to do in, I guess, what we could call TTC 2.0. There's a lot more work to do. We want to get this part of the project done and implemented, and then we need to kind of regroup and reprioritize in terms of the timing of the work that's left. So, yeah, this is a major project. It's not. We're not done yet. There's more to look at. In terms of those other instructional academic staff titles, and kind of also, like I talked about in the last question, making sure that we've gotten that assessment correct. I think the question just disappeared because I think I missed part of that. So there we go. So we will be looking at those and really kind of trying to keep that work moving forward. Lecture was just the first, but we will be looking at those other titles and trying to create a level of consistency from where we are now. Question 5, do you foresee any future system level efforts to help maintain equity across departments on campus where pay for lectures and or teaching faculty are concerned, especially if there's an ability to progress? So I think one of the benefits of the project is we're really trying to re-examine our compensation practices as a system and trying to develop a little bit more consistency. So we are opening up more flexible policies, but we're also creating better pathways for us to systematically review how those policies are applied and what that impact is. And so I think behind the scenes in terms of what we're doing as compensation professionals is really kind of working with HR leaders and trying to create better systems so that we can talk about equity issues. Now, being able to do that work and ask those questions is a step 1. But then you really have to ask that next question of how does that interact with finance? How does that interact with budgets and leadership? How does that interact with the state legislature in terms of what we have the authority to correct? But absolutely, one of the concerns of the project is how do we do this better? How do we have a compensation system that provides us with more insight into the type of questions that are necessary to ask to have a fairer, more equitable system? So, question 6 is, my main concern is that on smaller campuses, one person must often perform multiple roles that extend across multiple titles and job families versus larger institutions where there's a single job title that might be performed by multiple employees in the same department. So, this question doesn't, how you map to a job duty. Typically, if there's, we'll say, two titles, and you're falling between two titles and using, there's more to the question, using different, having different tasks performed, and there's a higher, more general title, you typically go to that higher, more general title. Or if those titles are at the same level, you might choose one title over the other, but that doesn't necessarily have a compensation impact because they're two jobs leveled at the same level. So really, when you're looking at jobs, you're generally asking that best fit question for compensation. So the example is, an employee with lecturer responsibilities is also an instrumentation technician, lab technician. Very specific, and without looking at the details, I'd be very hesitant to answer that. But looking at those mixed jobs, you're really looking at what is the best fit. If I had to post and rehire that position, what would you be asking for as that primary set of responsibilities? And that's usually what's going to lead that compensation question in terms of how do you level that person by job title and find the right compensation category. We see that a lot, especially in the IT realm, where you may, at a smaller institution, have someone doing multiple disciplines of IT, and you have to find that one of, what is that primary set of role? What would you hire for? What's the critical skill? So, there's absolutely ways in which institutions have that discussion in terms of finding best fit. When I pause, I'm always just looking at the screen waiting for your question. So, for instructional academic staff, why collapse one title series lectures into one title while leaving other instructional academic staff, say the professor series, in a series of title? Additionally, tenured faculty also have a series of titles, seems to create inconsistencies. So this really goes back to what we're seeing in the in the compensation survey results in terms of how do we want to align to the market. What we see in the market tends to be an instructor and ranked faculty, and a lecturer and ranked teaching professors. So what you're seeing in the library right now is a teaching professor single SJD, because it's one bucket of work. I think over time, what you will probably see is as campuses work through their policies about how to apply a teaching professor, and opening up of the availability of a progression that parallels the professor series for teaching professor. That is something that has to be talked about at a campus level. If you look back at the faculty resolution at Madison, that really kind of kicked off the call for a teaching professor title. They noted in particular the need that should probably align to that professor series. So really, in aligning to that market, where I think that future state where we want to get to is looking at lecturer, and then looking towards that teaching professor with nuanced titles within it, associate, assistant, so on, paralleling that professor. Again, that's part of, I think, of the work of local governance. So making sure that we have those standards and those laid out. Again, part of the reason why we're not mapping to the teaching professor is because we're still talking about that as how do we get there and what does that look like? So two-step process here. We're reforming the lecture title. We're keeping the ability to recognize people using business titles. We're maintaining that flexibility to compensate lectures through pay progression, still exists. We're not necessarily putting a maximum limit on that, so you're not losing the potential for salary increase simply because you're in that lecturer standard job title. And we're exploring and opening up that possibility of a title that we really think better matches the market. So I'm getting the sign that it's time for us to close out, and I think my last comments really probably summed up, but I want to probably do that again. I think from a project perspective, we want to be clear that senior lecturer is not going away because it's going to be there as a business title, and that business title is a credible part. It's housed in our HRS data systems. It's what feeds out onto, say, business cards and websites. It's how people recognize where you fall within in the organization. That very good question about does it create a ceiling or a hard stop for people if they've moved from a senior lecturer title of record to a lecturer title of record? And the answer is no. Will there be opportunities to increase pay? Yes, our pay progression guidelines provide that flexibility for campuses to kind of provide salary increases over time to people within that title, because we're explicitly trying to take away or remove that tie to title progression promotion as the way in which people advance, and really moving towards pay progression through a range. So really kind of retaining that ability. And then we're really consistently exploring that idea of how do we introduce the teaching professor, and really doing that in a way that suits individual institutions. And I think when we get that all done, what we'll find is that we have a new set of instructional academic staff titles that hopefully work better for the career instructional academic staff who are deeply embedded in our institutions, and still are able to provide salary growth and movement for people who are in that lecturer title who may not have that same standard of a teaching professor. And I certainly know from the comments that I've received from lecturers that really that teaching professor might well be a better suited title, but we got to take the steps and the work to get there, and really work that on through governance. So I think that is all the time we have. And I'm just double checking with our technical people to see if there's any last minute questions or closing comments. But I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen today or listen online. Please do feel free to send us questions and concerns. We really want to make a title structure that ultimately provides more clarity over time. But the change to get there can be difficult, and I think it's wrought with a lot of concerns, and we want to be addressing those concerns. And if there are concerns that come forward that we can't address, we want to put some thought about how do we solve those for people. So thank you.